Hello, I'm Elaine Ford and welcome to the BCAS at COP26, an exciting series of programmes exploring the issues at the heart of a successful COP26 outcome. BCAS is a centre for business, climate change and sustainability at the University of Edinburgh. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Soleil Garcia Ferrari, Personal Chair of Global Urbanism and Resilience at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Philip Cotton, Director of Human Capital Development at the Mastercard Foundation, and Julia Mashingas, Mastercard Foundation Scholar at Edinburgh University, studying global agriculture and food security. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's get the conversation going. What's the top outstanding question at the forefront of your mind? Obviously, this is a large topic, which we will delve into in much more detail, but I'd love to hear your perspective in 45 seconds max each. Soli, if we could start with you first, please.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you for inviting me today. My work over the past 5 years has focused on climate change resilient communities through working directly with those that have been affected by changes in climate and in their environment, and collaboratively with other organizations like government, NGOs and academia, look for strategies and solutions that mitigate the impact of climate change and explore a maybe deeper and long-term adaptation, which will be based on actions that are the results of shared responsibilities. So my biggest question within our work is how to increase the scale of these actions and activities that are taking place within small communities, and how to develop decision-making systems that change the parameters for actions with perhaps a higher level of autonomy at the local level.
Thank you, Soleil. Phil, what is the top outstanding question at the forefront of your mind?
Thanks very much. I think for me, it's about young people. It's about how do we enable young people to get involved in order to achieve the greatest impact, because my whole career has been about working in learning institutions and working with learners. And so focusing on young people and their agency and their voice is at the forefront of my mind as we tackle these issues.
Thank you, Phil. And Gillian, I'd love to hear your perspective.
For me, I guess the main thing has always been around behavioral change, especially in regards to the foods we eat, as well as how we can become more sustainable with them. I've always found that there is like a general relationship between sustainable and healthy eating. We live in a society today where a lot of people don't quite realize the increased importance, especially around climate change, as well as a lot of health risks that are coming up, especially through these non-communicable diseases. So the main question to me is how we can kind of get those messages out to the masses and promote healthy and sustainable eating in the long term.
Thank you all. These are really interesting questions I'd love to explore further. Soleil, could you speak to how communities engage effectively in the development and implementation of solutions aimed to mitigate the impact of climate change?
All our work and success of developing collaboratively solutions that could be applicable to specific conditions within the communities where we're working is rooted in the idea of a dialogue of knowledges, but a dialogue of knowledges which kind of builds from a level platform. So we value community knowledge as much as technical knowledge, as much as academic knowledge, and we try to work through inequalities and perceptions of the needs and the solutions through a kind of constructive, sustainable dialogue, which helps us understanding how these communities can provide solutions or provide a specific understanding of the risks in their particular environments to then lead to solutions. And this also helps empowering these communities and responding to many challenges that our cities experience, not just in the global south, but also in the global north in relation to marginalization and fragmented, urban areas where there is a sort of sense of place that is being lost. So I think that the creation of systems where we can begin from young ages to understand the value of these different knowledges, I think is really, really important.
Building on this, though, I wanted to ask you how institutions can support the development of solutions that are tackling the impact of climate change inclusively.
There's different ways in which we can support. So I feel that perhaps institutions have a range of roles to play. NGOs have always supported community action, but mostly have supported in these particularly vulnerable areas and informal areas, have supported reactive approaches from community to government action. And they have tried to help communities have a say, express their needs to government institutions. But academia had a more silent role over the last few years. And I feel that perhaps academia should be more involved in creating the links and building the platforms for interaction through the different understandings of knowledge and promoting these different forms of understanding the impact of climate change in particular places. So I do feel that perhaps academia needs to think about their role. And at the same time, I do think that there is that perhaps these collective actions, these activities that are taking place at the local level could begin to help us developing a framework for interaction in cities where we promote the capacity to make decisions at the local level. So we promote perhaps a higher level of autonomy from communities in making decisions about their environment and their territory.
Thank you very much. Philip and Gillian, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. If we could go to Phil first.
I agree with Solly. I think it's getting it right, isn't it? And part of it is about looking at the incentives for universities to do anything, and what are the ways in which universities are ranked and rated and scored and compared with one another, and how that drives the kind of activity within universities. Because what Solly is talking about is a bit of a shift, rather a fundamental shift in the way that we do things, and to engage with communities in a way that learning takes place for scholars in those communities. I think we often, particularly in undergraduate learning, and maybe Julian, who's been through an undergraduate degree before, can attest to it, that we tend to teach the theory in the classroom and then we send the students out, rather than sending the students out in some kind of rapid participatory appraisal kind of exercise, and then bringing them back into the university to try and map their thinking to some kind of theoretical framework or perspective. But actually understanding communities before they start to within their notebooks in lecture theatres, I think is one simple way to flip things, but increasingly to open up our university to the local community, so members of the community can come into the university as well as the university going out of its own buildings. But Julian, it'd be good to hear your perspective.
Definitely. I think I agree with both of you. And I think when it does come to like research or innovation, we always kind of forget about the local communities. And we always try and present them solutions that aren't really to the problems that they have. I think like this, and I think I'm going to talk about soil quite a bit, but it just reminds me of this study I was reading around Ethiopia and their chickpea, and how like they were provided with tractors and this new way of cultivating, but they still preferred to use their ox-drawn plows, just because of the soil compaction issues that came up with this new high-tech solution to a problem that they didn't necessarily have. Their main problem had been around how they were rotating the crops over the season, and how that was kind of like promoting like certain resistant strains into their chickpea. But researchers thought the problem was that they weren't being productive enough, and that by providing them with tractors that would compact the soil, even get stuck in it during the rain season, that would solve the solution in the long term. And I think that's a lot of the thinking that does go into some of these innovations or ideas that are directed at the global south. We don't often take the time to like interact with people and get the communities at the heart of this into like our problem solving loop. And because of that, we come up with solutions which are great. You know, you can provide drones and all these exciting things, but the issue might be something simpler and cheaper that if you talk to the person beforehand, you would have worked towards that. And that's definitely something that can be integrated more into like the undergrad curriculum, knowing the needs of like the local community and then kind of building off from there. So I definitely agree with both of you on that.
Phil, can you speak to how higher education institutions can position themselves to lead climate action?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the very simple way to look at how higher education institutions can position themselves is to look at their three mandates, you know, research and teaching and community service. And in research, there's a lot of activity that is going on. If you look at the Aurora University Network, for example, which I find quite interesting and I've heard quite a lot about, the way in which universities can use that network to position themselves, to begin to map their research to the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And I think there's quite a lot of research going on that's being driven by the issues that we want to talk about today. I think with teaching, there's a real need to really look at a transdisciplinary approach to teaching, to see a whole new range of degrees being delivered, you know, whether it's economics for the Sustainable Development Goals or whether they're degrees that reconfigure environmental health to planetary health or One Health and such like. So much more transdisciplinarity. I think also in terms of community service, thinking about how we reach out to our local communities, how we serve our local communities. But before we do that, look at how we serve the communities that are our universities, you know, in terms of purchasing policies within universities, sustainable purchasing policies, being very careful about the ingredients and the food that we buy within and serve up within our campuses. Of course, there are some frameworks we can use, such as the Green Campus movement. And I think these are movements that are maybe at the forefront of where we can be. But we should also look at the way in which we power our campuses. Many of the universities that we work with in the African continent are beginning to really push forward the whole narrative around devices and connectivity for learners and for faculty. And that's going to have a huge impact on the power requirements within those campuses. So how can we begin to look at that and address those issues in the future? So yeah, let's have some really cutting edge scientific research and transdisciplinary research. Let's see some really forward thinking curricula across a diverse range of disciplines. Let's upskill our faculty and our students with cutting-edge learning methods that enable people to engage with learning as they progress through life and beyond the discipline-specific work that they're doing while studying at university. Let's build on those collaborations with industry and local communities around climate action. And let's make sure that universities actually lead and provide a place, a convening place for young people, scientists, local community to come together and take forward this whole agenda. There are some specific examples within our scholarship network, and I won't speak to Edinburgh as an example, but Earth University in Costa Rica and their group of affiliated institutions and how they're teaching students and the next generation of world leaders to serve rural areas and to develop global food systems. And just fascinating work that's being done in so many universities, but perhaps we don't know about because we're not sharing. Thank you.
So could you speak to transformative intersectionality and climate change from what one person can do regardless of the space that they're in?
Thank you, Elaine. I think in our experience, we realize when we try to look for solutions in these vulnerable areas that communities are best placed to understand their environment. They know what is happening, they know how things are changing around it, and they are developing adaptation strategies. So I feel that if we can build from these knowledge, and if we can understand what they have been trying to do by themselves, and bring this understanding and this capacity to adapt and change at the community level to organizations that will make decisions, we are going to be in a much stronger position to increase the scale of action. So look into generating interactions across sectors that will then lead to much larger scale programs for adaptive transformation and long-term change, sustainable change in these areas. So through empowering these understanding and these knowledge is where we feel that the mitigation and adaptation solutions could emerge with a much stronger impact in these areas.
Thank you, Snella. Gillian, as a member of the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Programme, can you speak to supporting transformative leadership and the relationship between intersectionality and climate change?
Yeah, that's definitely something I can do. And because transformative leadership is always a term that's interested me, because when I first joined the program, I had no idea what it was. Almost 3 years in, I'm still learning bit by bit what it is, but it's this whole idea where you have to more or less broaden your perspectives and talk to people from different disciplines. And this interdisciplinary thinking always comes up with interesting or different solutions to how we're currently doing things. I guess for me, like I study like an agricultural degree, so I'm always very much from a science context. And a lot of the things I do say or kind of produce are always based on data, but it always lacks that human aspect to a point. And that's just something that I've learned how to better engage with just through talking to different people within the program. And they've built up this informal authority over me. Maybe it's through like the art industry in Africa and how it's at a stage where it's not promoted well and people aren't engaging with people. And because of that, they are looking for solutions to kind of show that it is an avenue of doing that. And I feel like there are certain things that relate with that to agriculture in the global south at the moment. Like a lot of farmers don't really have the time to focus on the problems that are at the heart of what they're doing because they're trying to just get production for now. So this means that they don't have sustainable thought systems in how they deal with certain situations. They're looking to get the highest yield at this moment in time. And what they do is they might not look at like simple cultivation methods, or they might not look at more artistic ways of doing things like just general intercropping. And this leads to like general long-term soil degradation. And we're in a situation where now you're limiting your capacity in the next 10 years. So that's quite disappointing. But I was just reading an interesting article just to kind of tie back to this whole art piece where there was a certain artist within Zimbabwe. And basically what he did is he saw like a plot of land and he decided to more or less get like different kinds of produce in and try and make beautiful floral art. And what happened by chance was that someone saw this and they saw that there was some biodiversity connotations to doing this, like growing potatoes with sugar cane. Something as simple as that in an art piece could have like a long-term benefit to the soil, to fixing it and making things more productive. And that's more or less what transformative leadership means to me. It's like talking to people with different perspectives and coming in from different angles, but coming up with like these high-tech solutions that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of that might meet a need now rather than later on. And to me, that's pretty cool and something that I'm trying to explore and better engage with, because there are frustrating things of speaking to people from different spectrums from you as well.
Thanks very much, Gillian. That sounds super innovative. Thank you so much for sharing. If we could build on what you've just covered, Phil, what do you think are the fundamental set of values needed to motivate young people to take action?
Okay, I'm going to say these, but I'm going to look at Julian to make sure that he's agreeing with me. And if he's not, then I'll shut up. So Julian, I'm speaking to you here. I think the fundamental set of values include the following: openness and engagement, a value around discovery, that institutions should always be looking at creating new knowledge and creating new knowledge in new ways with young people. Collegiality, working across disciplines, as we've mentioned, but listening to young people, role modeling that change is possible. And sometimes within our institutions, we suggest to young people that change is not possible because our institutions are so heavy, but role modeling that it is possible, building alliances all the time with grassroots communities, but ensuring consistency and congruency and coherence in those relationships, and values around celebrating people's contributions and the things that people bring to the table. Values around boldness, around action orientation, around authenticity and trust, around enablement. Julian, am I doing okay so far?
Doing pretty great.
Maybe you should come in and help me here on this. But those are some of the values, and maybe Solly and myself come from the same kind of perspective as university academics, but creating an environment that gives room for failure for young people, perhaps, creating an environment that allows young people to take the lead in area of interests in a way that is guiding and not imposing. Those kinds of things.
Julian, what are your thoughts on incentivizing young people to take action?
I think it's very crucial that young people do take a lot of action. And I think, like Phil did say, one thing that I found struck a chord with me, and that's like the ability to know that you are allowed to fail. I feel like just the general university environment or ecosystem is one where it is so competitive and people always become more or less within themselves because there is this belief that if they fail, that they can't really get up. And that's always something that I want to emphasize, that it is okay to fail, it is okay to get things wrong, and that there are support systems in place to move on. The next thing is always just around criticism. It's not easy to take criticism, and it's always like fostering this attitude that you should always be prepared to take criticism and see how you can improve from it or build up to be a better individual, more holistic individual in the process. And finally, just the ability to talk to people, because people are at the heart of everything. Without the people, there's really nothing. And it's always like talking from people from like the top to the bottom. And that's such a difficult skill to do, to be able to talk to someone maybe from a more vulnerable situation and to talk to someone like who's the head of the MasterCard Foundation. Like that is a skill in of itself, and it's something that does need to be cultivated and put into people, where we can treat these people equally and value their opinions and ideas and try and grow based off of them.
Thank you, Julian. How does the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Programme try to cultivate young leaders to combat these issues?
How does it? That's a really good question. And I guess from my experience, and I hope Phil does get the outputs that he hopes to get from this, but I think one thing that they've always emphasized is the community that you're in at any given moment or time and the networks that you create. Community is something that's very important, whether it's the community you form here in Edinburgh or the community you form back home. And the one thing that the MasterCard Foundation has always just said is always try and foster this, always try and create networks and links, always value the opinion of anyone you come across, always take away that prejudice you do have. I just remember always coming into the program. I went to like a very military style school where I was always used to just saying sir or calling people by their last name. And someone within the foundation said, don't do that. Just call me by my first name, because by doing that, you put us on an even playing field and we're able to talk more openly and freely. So that's one thing that has struck with me years later, and something that I'm always often trying to do, just take that away and just connect with a person at their most basic level. And once you do that, you can actually make progress and discuss ideas with them and build future bonds for a better community in general. So that's more or less my answer, and hopefully
Thank you so much, Julian. So do you think we're seeing the necessary ambition needed to support these initiatives?
I'll answer that question in a second, but I think what Julian is saying makes me really happy because it shows my house. I think what Julian is saying makes me really happy because it makes me reflect on the opportunity of the Scholars Program in relation to developing an understanding of the role each individual, each student has in promoting change, in bringing about change, the role they have in thinking about a better future, a more sustainable future, and the capacity and the leadership they can embed in to achieve these. So I'm not sure if we are achieving that across the whole university, but definitely I think the initiatives such as the MasterCard Scholars Program help us thinking out of the box of how to plan education and how to engage with different institutions and provide a sort of experiential learning process within our community of students. So words coming from Julian because it really reflects those ambitions. So,
yeah, and Solly, if I can add to what you've said, and Julian mentioned outputs, and our outputs are simply the numbers of students who get scholarships, but what we're interested in is the outcomes, the kinds of things that Julian talked about young people who are connected, who have networks, who can tap into networks, who can feed into networks, young people who are prepared to stand up and make change in their friendship group, in their local communities, maybe through the jobs that they get or the jobs that they create through their entrepreneurial activities. But part of the impact of young people is the impact they have on institutions. And there's some lovely examples, Solly, from your own institution of where MasterCard Foundation Scholars, as an example of a group of scholars, has really made an impact on the way the universities do things. And it's the universities that we need to change, because the young people who are the scholars in those universities are up for change, who are ready for change. And so I thank Julian for being a scholar and Solly for being a teacher.
Thanks, Bill. Julian, can we go to you? How do Global South communities develop when they're disproportionately impacted by climate change? Should they have more leniency towards this?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I'm always thinking about and always battling to find an answer. But the fact is, right now, the biggest polluters are G20 countries, or those countries who are now going into all those countries in their current industrial, post-industrial phases. For me, the biggest thing is, as a Global South country, is not to kind of have leniency in the approaches of the policies you make, but learn from the lessons of others and take up those lessons in a way to more or less combat some of the climate uses, that climate problems, that occur in our world today. An instance of this is always just like with educational programs, like these have been embedded quite well into the global north, but there still is a lot of room and space for them to get embedded in the global south, the kind of thinking where you have a sustainable curriculum, where if you have people learning, going into industry, you make them think about like, what is the most sustainable practice to do? What is the best way to achieve an output? Engineers, what's the best way to kind of get water to one place? But while they're thinking about this, they also have to think, what effect are we going to have on this lake over here? Will they be pollutants going into it, things like that? It's just the willingness to embed that sustainable curriculum into the way we think. And if we can do that early on, we might never ever get to the stage where we are at, where not G20 countries have more or less contributed to like the situation we are in, where we have that hard read of an IPCC report.
The most polluted countries are those in the G20, and I think your previous question was about how are we seeing this ambition to support initiatives? And in our work, and this is really short, but in our work, we are not. We realize that yes, we are very successful at the local level, at the neighborhood scale, at promoting community engagement, empowering communities to develop strategies in their neighborhoods. But when we start thinking about the long term, particularly when we engage with government institutions, we tend to have resistance because of the political cycle. Governments are very short-term thinkers. They have their ambitions are very much within a short period of time, and this is where I feel that we need to think about these connections. We need to interlink all of these activities at the local level across different countries and global south and global north, and share areas of knowledge and share practice and support then deeper change that hopefully will create wider impact.
Thank you, Solheim. Phil, what strategies and principles should inform global dialogue for climate action?
I think we've probably touched on a fair number of them, but I would start by saying inclusion is probably the key thing, that everyone needs to be involved in the dialogue, particularly those who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and those people who find their voices the most difficult to be heard, and so creating agency and voice for different groups of individuals as we cascade out this dialogue is incredibly important. I mean, Africa is going to be the most vulnerable continent possibly to climate change, with all sorts of issues over water and water supply, infrastructure, agriculture, and livelihoods. And you know, of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world, 7 are in Africa. You know, countries like Mozambique, Malawi, Ghana, and Madagascar. And you know, Julian touched on tillage systems within agriculture, like no tillage and low tillage systems, and some of the rather bizarre interventions that had been introduced that made no sense to people, and they made no sense to the people who were the subjects of those interventions. But once those subjects had been listened to and the essence of their understanding had been recorded, then the people who'd even imposed those interventions perhaps would take a step back and realize the folly of their ways. And so we need to make sure that we not only hold dear to inclusion, but we actually start the conversation down in the grassroots, down in the communities that are most affected by the rigors of climate change. And although many of those communities are often, because of their marginalization or their rurality, they tend to be disempowered in terms of the ways that we are often find ourselves connected and able to communicate, the work really needs to be invested there.
Thank you, Phil. We're almost at the end of today, so let's summarise our hopes for COP26 outcomes. Julian, what are your hopes for a successful COP26 outcome?
I guess one word comes to mind, and that's just more ambitious policies, especially in regards to countries going net zero. It's just something that I've just observed because I've recently just been reading a lot of like business articles, and you get like big 4 supermarket corporations in the UK saying we're going to go net zero. Instead of 2050, we're bringing our day closer to 2035. And I guess for me, that brings up the question, were your targets ambitious enough to begin with? Were there changes you could have done sooner or beforehand that could have brought this about? And it's, I guess, the same with a lot of global North governments. Like the Paris Agreement was pretty good, but you asked the question, was it ambitious enough? And did people act on it enough to kind of get the results or outputs they needed? So for me, I think the best outcome would be a better planned, thought out roadmap to what net zero really looks like, and a more ambitious and aggressive target to meet that, because we are in a circumstance where, once again, like the global south is more disproportionately affected by this, but it doesn't mean it's not going to reach the global north at some point as well. And if we don't tackle this now, we won't have a later to do it. So that is my main hope and the main outcome that I want. Like a change in the timeline and to make them, or better yet, bring them closer to the dates we need to achieve the targets to keep this planet around for much longer.
Thank you, Gillian. And so what outcomes would you like to see at the COP26?
Thanks, Elaine. I was at the COP25 in Madrid, and I think my hope for COP26 is that it does engage much more with these realities we talked about today. I feel COP becomes a very high level, almost slightly empty of content conversation. And I was really hoping, and unfortunately, because of COVID, we had much less opportunities for preparation to COP26 in terms of interactions, bringing about our experiences, particularly when we're working in these vulnerable locations. We promoted ways in which we can share our experience through exhibitions, through bringing videos with experiences and testimonials. That's what I would say. Bringing videos with testimonials and trying to ensure that the voice of those who have been more affected is really heard. My main worry is that at the moment, if we keep these conversations at these very high detached level of political cycles with a really short-term intention, we might continue with the same speculative sort of development, capital-led development that we are experiencing so far, and we will not really reach the moment in which we need to develop deeper change. So think about how we can work with those more segregated areas, with more excluded areas, with the marginalized areas that we talked about. How do we break these boundaries, and how do we give voice to these most affected groups of people in society? And I think we mentioned before how people, particularly Julian, gave examples how the core here is people. So why we need to have more presence of people in COP.
Thank you, Sola. And Phil, what are your hopes for the COP26?
Well, I think to see outcomes that record for history the influence of the Global South, such as the Kigali Amendment, which came about because of robust leadership from the Global South, and that I think addresses some of Solly's concerns and hopes for COP26. I did reach out and ask 3 young people, 2 of whom work at the MasterCard Foundation, one as an intern, one as a partner, but also a marine conservation biology student from the University of Cape Town, what their hopes would be for COP26, Elaine, because I thought that would be far more interesting than my hopes for COP26. And they raise far lesser carbon emission by 2030, despite all efforts. So hoping that COP26 this year ensures that we actualize this goal. And another young person that I spoke to said, finally, I would like to see greater commitment from governments and all stakeholders involved to protecting natural habitats and ecosystems, such as forests and biodiversity. So yeah, lots of hopes. But as Solly said, bring it down from that lofty, empty conversation. We want something more than COP26 preceded COP27 and came after COP25, but that COP26 marked a sea change in the conversations that we have and the way in which we transform the future of this planet and the people who live on it.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all our panelists, Dr. Solia Gracia Ferrari, Professor Philip Cotton, and Julia Mashingaze. There are more BCAS at COP series coming up. To learn more and participate further, check out BCAS Thought Leadership releases on the University of Edinburgh Business School website and LinkedIn. Links are posted in the description below. Thank you all very much and for watching BCAS at COP26. Thank you.